You're listening to Radio Manpasand on FM 91.1 and also on our app, Radio Manpasand. Australia has a great tradition of volunteering. We see volunteers everywhere devoting hours of their time in emergency situations, helping disadvantaged people, assisting in community events and sporting events. In fact, just about any field of our lives, volunteers are making valuable contributions and making significant difference. In fact, our own radio program is run by a team of dedicated volunteers, and one of our volunteer, RJ Manish, as you know, has been given a Volunteer Leadership Award for 2024. So volunteers are making a big contribution to this society. And here, a volunteering ACT is the peak body which is coordinating volunteering activities in ACT. Today, we have a pleasure of talking to Jean Giese, who is the CEO of the volunteering ACT. Welcome, Jean, to our radio program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we were just talking about volunteering is such a huge, big tradition in Australia. What are the reasons for that?
That's a good question. The ACT has traditionally had the highest number of volunteers in Australia, which gives us some insights into why people are coming together and volunteering. But across the country, we have numbers between 73 and 75% of people aged over 16 volunteering last year. So when we did a state of volunteering research report, it showed very, very high numbers of people aged 16 and over that volunteered at least once. Those numbers are in of themselves absolutely incredible.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
I think the reason that volunteering is so well loved and cherished within Australia is because of a number of things. That we quite often talk about volunteering. Yeah. So I think that in itself helps people identify themselves as volunteers.
Yep.
So what we hear, particularly in multicultural communities, in First Nations communities, is that they're volunteering, but they're not necessarily calling themselves a volunteer. And so the really interesting part of the research that we did was to ask questions in such a way to make sure that people were saying, oh, hang on, the work that I'm doing is actually volunteering, even if for 10 years before that, they weren't referring to it as volunteering. So I think there's an interesting conversation about what do we mean by volunteering? Yeah. What does it look like in different communities? But ultimately, I think Australians, we live in a beautiful, vast country, and we do what we can to look after each other. And Australians are relatively privileged. And so volunteering is also about having the time and the capacity and the resources to volunteer. So we've got lots of the right conditions in place where people can get up on the weekend and say, I want to go and help the neighbour, or I want to go to the church and see what they need done, or I want to go and deliver meals, or the huge variety of things that happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. As you said, that a lot of us, we do volunteer work without realizing that we are doing the volunteer work. So let's define what is actually volunteering and what are various types of volunteering.
Yeah, so as you said in your introduction, volunteering is what makes our communities run. So without volunteers, health, education, arts, sports, culture, environment, all of those things do not happen without the involvement of volunteers in our communities. In terms of a definition, and it's not perfect, but we say that volunteering is about giving your time willingly so that no one's making you do it. So that's what the willingly part of that is. Without a financial gain. So if you're being paid, that's when it starts to be mimic an employment arrangement, and for the common good. So we say that volunteering is about the common good. So it's about doing something that improves somebody's life or improves community life. So they're the three markers.
Okay.
Common good, no financial gain, and time willingly given. And so whenever people come to us and they say, we're going to involve volunteers in our organisation, if it doesn't hit those three markers broadly, we would say it's not volunteering. But we also, the definition isn't perfect because, of course, that doesn't take into account some of the cultural imperatives that sit behind volunteering. It doesn't take into account that we're moving away, particularly in Australia, from what is formal volunteering to informal volunteering. And that is, formal volunteering describes activity that happens really regularly. So you turn up on Wednesday every week to do the same activity, and you have a structured relationship with the organisation. That's formal. Informal volunteering is the work that we all do without necessarily identifying it as volunteering. So it is helping out your neighbour. It's setting up the equipment at sport on Saturday for your child to play soccer. It's helping out at the school. It's helping out in churches. A lot of those spaces have more informal volunteering practices, and that's where the definition isn't perfect, but it helps us at least arrive at what do we mean by this.
Yeah. So we just we're talking about how does volunteering contributing to the society. So how does it help actually? Are there any figures? I was looking at the figures. They were saying like $1 billion.
Yeah.
And is it included in the GDP or not?
No, it's not. And so the research that we did last year, yes, did try to identify if in Canberra every volunteer said, I'm not doing this anymore, and the government had to replace all of those volunteers with paid workers, the government would need to find an additional $3.3 billion every year, which
that's a huge figure.
Huge figure. And of course that would never happen because volunteers are not all going to stand down.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting litmus test to say that's the contribution of people who are turning up to do something that they believe in. Volunteering has so many benefits. Of course, it benefits the individual that's being supported, the organisations that are being supported, their capacity increases. It enhances schools, it enhances the environment. All of the beautiful parts of Canberra, you can go bushwalking, most of them are maintained by volunteers. So at all of these points, it is volunteers who are making organisations and communities thrive. But volunteering also has incredible impacts on the individual. So it's been shown to relieve stress, it's been shown to alleviate symptoms of depression. It of course makes you better connected. It's a perfect pathway to employment, it's a pathway to retirement, it's a connector, it's a way of feeling like you're giving back to something you believe in. And so we always say if doctors could recommend volunteering, you go to the doctor and they say, well, our diagnosis is you need to volunteer, that would be great. And they can't, of course, but there's just this wealth of research about how it's actually good for you. And the best way that you hear that described is that volunteering gives you what's called the helper's high, the high that you get off helping other people. So volunteering should make you feel good. You should be able to walk away from that and say, I did something good today and I feel better about myself and I made a new friend and I learnt something new and I stepped out of my comfort zone and I'm feeling really proud of myself. That's the experience we want people to have.
That explains the reason of Manish being so happy. And
absolutely. Manish is one of the happiest people I've ever met and one of the most, volunteers more than most of us are able to. You might be onto something.
That's right. Yeah. So you just mentioned the contribution in the monetary terms, billions of dollars. Do you see any trend where because of the funding pressures on government, services are now being delivered by volunteers rather than by the government agencies?
Yeah, in some spaces, yes. So we as the peak body invest a lot of our time in advocacy for the sector, and the community sector in the ACT, and this is an Australian trend, they're all experiencing increased demand. So more and more people coming to services. We're all experiencing heightened demand on particularly services that are helping people who are experiencing disadvantage. The funding is not keeping up with that. It's not in step with the amount of people we're all supporting. And funding opportunities are incredibly limited, and organisations are operating in an environment where there's a lot more regulation, a lot more of that sits over what they need to do. So you can see the supply isn't increasing, the demand is increasing on services, if you think about it crudely in that way.
Yeah.
And so yes, we do sadly see in lots of spaces where people say, okay, well, we need to have more volunteers doing more of the work, And that's sadly where we need to step in our
Yeah.
advice to those organisations and say, well, you cannot replace a paid worker with a volunteer.
That's right.
So there's also a lot of work that we need to do around in helping organisations work out what's actually the right standard for their volunteers as well. But it is very common that we say, no, that's a paid role, that's not a volunteer role. So you can't ask a volunteer to do it.
That's
but
true.
again, it looks different in different fields and it looks different in different types of organisations. And we don't want anybody out there thinking, well, how do we manage this? That's what we're there for.
Yeah.
And if any of your listeners are listening from other parts of Australia, we do have state and territory peak bodies, our counterparts, that would be really happy to talk you through all of these things.
Yeah. So I think we just went on this definition of volunteering, and you basically working for no gain or no financial gain. And then you explained some of the benefits in briefly. Can you just elaborate on those benefits of being a volunteer?
So I think the reason that we all volunteer looks different.
Yeah.
So everybody's individual capacity is different from everybody else's. And so we always say to people who are volunteering, what is it that you want out of volunteering? And I think that's an important place to start, is what are volunteers seeking out of that volunteering opportunity? So sometimes it is, I'm disconnected and I don't have friends in Canberra, I don't, and I've just moved here. And we say, right, so you want volunteering to be a way for you to be able to connect. So we want to make sure you're in a volunteering role where you are engaging with lots of people and meeting new friends and making connections. So that's just one marker. People might say, well, I want to start a new career, or I want to get some experience on my resume. They might have really good qualifications, but workplaces are saying, no, you need to have some experience, which is very difficult. So people do use volunteering as a way to get experience. So they come into a job that gives them, where they're doing duties that build towards a career path, and then they get a job, and that's wonderful. Or it might be a pathway to retirement. As I said, people saying, I want to retire, but I still want to use my time, I want to use my skills to give back. And so it's a vehicle for that as well. And there's a lot of other motivations I haven't touched on, but everybody's got a different motivation for wanting to volunteer. And so it's important for us to work out, well, what is that motivation, and match make them with the right organisation for them. And then the benefits come from there. So if they're in an organisation that aligns with their values, so let's say somebody loves working with animals and animal protection, and we find them a really good role working in that space, the benefits of that are going to be set up for success in many ways from the start, because they're working in a sector that they believe in, they're doing work that they believe in, so they're naturally going to get that feeling of success. So the benefits of volunteering are just they're so vast, and they're so different for everyone's different experience. But at the core, it's about people finding the right fit for them. And you will, no doubt, we've all been in volunteering roles that weren't the right fit, and we've had to say, this just isn't right. And there's no judgment attached to that. It's just, it was the wrong fit. So you move away and find something else.
Yeah. So there's so many benefits of being a volunteer, but still there is a reluctance to become a volunteer. The usual excuse is, I do not have a time. When I retire, then I will look at the opportunities and all that. So what are the barriers in being a volunteer?
There are a number, and the research really wanted to focus in on why people aren't volunteering. Of course, because volunteering has been declining for about a decade in Australia, particularly formal volunteering. So those formal roles have been declining, where informal has been increasing. But on balance, we're still looking at decline of volunteering in totality. But like you've said, 50% of people we surveyed said, I just don't have time. And particularly in an environment like we're living in right now, where almost everyone's impacted by the cost of living, time is important. People want to have more time they either need to have time to be able to get a second job and bring more income into the family, or things are just so heightened and there's so much pressure in the world that people just want to have time to do things that aren't volunteering, and that's okay. And we say to people, give what you can, give as much time as you can, but we know that there's pressures. But the other two things that the survey found was the costs of volunteering were impacting. So for every hour of volunteering that you and I do, the average cost to us is $12 an hour. So we're paying out of pocket $12 an hour. The cost to the organisation for us to volunteer is $11 per hour. Now, if you get no funding to support volunteers, where are you going to find $23 per hour just to cover costs? That's not to cover anything else that you need to properly support volunteers. That's only just to put out the costs that we're paying out of pocket for parking, uniforms. I mean, there's a list of things, but that's a terrifying number because people are saying, I can't afford to volunteer. And so people think volunteering is free, and it is time given for free, but it is not free. There is a cost for individual volunteers. There is a cost for the organisation to properly engage volunteers. And if we don't highlight that, that's going to continue to be something that will impact. And the third barrier to volunteering that was reported was burnout. People just couldn't do it anymore. So the organisation, they'd either been asked to do too much over too long a period, they were juggling other parts of their life at the same time, and they said, I can't do this anymore. So those three barriers, time, cost and burnout, are pretty significant.
That's interesting burnout factor. Normally you go for volunteering to have that satisfaction rather than getting burnt out. And they were the results from people who are volunteering. So we also asked people that weren't volunteering. We got slightly different response because we wanted to work out, you're not volunteering. What's happening for you? What are the barriers for you? And so the results showed, again, no time was right up there. Some said, I'm not interested in volunteering. Don't want to. Absolutely fine. And the third was that they had never been asked. They didn't know how. And so again, it goes back to this sense of connection that sits in with volunteering, where I think those of us that have good networks and are lucky enough to have good networks could be asked to volunteer or know somebody, I've got a friend who might be able to help us do that. But there's lots of people out there that have never been asked. No one's ever said, have you thought about volunteering? And what a shame. We've got 20% of people who have never volunteered saying, well, no one's ever asked me. And I think, what a missed opportunity. That's right. For society in general.
Absolutely.
So do you see any difference as far as the demographics of the volunteer in terms of the age? Like, older people are more represented than younger people. Is that the case? Or
so if you look at the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics census data, which is the official data from government, they ask the question in a very different way, and so the result is very different. When we asked the question, again, we asked it in a very different way. So the independent researcher that commissioned the report, that we commissioned the report through, we wanted to ensure that we were capturing the fulsome picture of volunteering. We actually found that the highest number of volunteers are in that middle age group. And if you compare that to the census data, that's the lowest age group. And we believe the reason for that is, if you look at the census data, it's capturing people who are saying that they're volunteering. Yes, I understand, I'm volunteering, I'm doing all this good work. Because we were asking people to identify volunteering and look at it differently, what we were finding is that people in that middle age group, between 35 and 50, are actually volunteering the most likely in my mind, because they're the ones that might have kids at school and they're constantly giving their time. I mean, you give your time at the school, you give your time at sport, you give your time to the church, you give your time to the neighbours, and a lot of the volunteering you're doing at that, particularly if you have children, I'm coming to this with some bias because I have two small children, so a lot of the volunteering I do isn't what ordinarily I would be doing. It's because my kids are at school, or because my kid's playing this sport, and so you're doing a lot of informal volunteering that's part of you being, part of, and you can be, a lot of people in my age demographic are also supporting parents,
Right.
and so they're heavily involved in supporting other people. So and caregiving, of course, being different from volunteering, but it's not uncommon for people who are caregiving to also be providing informal care to neighbours and other people around their elderly parents as well. So there's all these moving parts where we identified actually it's that group that are volunteering the most, which is very different from the census data, which shows that the highest numbers are young people and people that have retired. So if you compare and contrast, you get these really interesting insights. And for us, all of the insights are important. And it's looking at, well, what was the question? What was the methodology? And what are the differences? And from that, you can you get a different answer, which is fascinating.
That's right. I think it comes back to that fundamental question: how do we perceive volunteering?
Absolutely.
So, can anyone volunteer? If I want to volunteer, do I need to go undergo any training?
Depends what it is. It depends what it is. I mean, yes, anybody, we'll find a role for anybody. So if you're not able to find a volunteering role, come and engage with us and we will find you something. It depends on the role. So, you know, there are restrictions, of course, around which organisations can involve children in volunteering. So we have a lot of young people interested in volunteering. Some organisations are not able to have them as volunteers because of their age, because there are insurance or other risk-related decisions made. There are people who might not pass a police check or have conditions on the Working with Vulnerable People card that might stop them from being able to engage in some volunteering roles that require a different level of compliance. So my answer is yes, anyone can volunteer, but in some cases we need to work out what are the right roles for you and what are the right organisations that are able to involve you. We do lots of work, and our banner's behind me, around inclusion in volunteering, where we actively work with volunteers to identify why they're not involving volunteers from different backgrounds. So whether that be people living with a disability, whether that be culturally and linguistically diverse communities, First Nations volunteers. So we're actively working with organisations to ensure that organisations are as inclusive as they can be, but that's a big piece of work because it's you need to do lots of work to understand what is the barrier for that organisation and how do we overcome it. But your question about training again depends on the role. So I mean, most organisations have a minimum set of. We need to do some workplace health and safety training, we need to make sure we've got your details, we need to do some form of induction, and then you've got other roles where training is mandatory and really important for the safeguarding of people. So if you take Lifelines volunteers, for instance, they're at the coalface of dealing with people in crisis. Of course their volunteers need to be trained and trained really well. So it depends on what the role is, it depends on the organisation, but there is a role out there for everyone. Sometimes it's just about needing some support in finding that.
So just in terms of the demographics, you just alluded to the CALD communities. I just wanted to find out, has there been any survey, how much volunteering is done by CALD communities, or is it if it is not enough, do we take into account, like, if we take an Indian community, a lot of volunteer work is done through the temples. Is it included in your formal surveys? Or?
It was. So our survey did ask one question that is in that vein, and that was how many. So when we surveyed organisations and the volunteer managers, we said how many of you are involving volunteers from culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and that response was about 52%. So about 52% said we are actively engaging people from culturally and linguistically diverse communities. That number's low and is a concern, and so we're doing some projects at the moment to work on capacity building of organisations in just that space. I'm not aware of research that's been done particularly from the other side, but it's certainly something for us to think about, because as I said at the start, we know volunteering in community looks very different. I'm a white woman.
Yeah.
I've been brought up with a very Western concept of volunteering where I can
Yeah.
very clearly identify where I'm volunteering and where I'm not. But we know in cultural communities, it is ingrained in community
Yes,
that, you know,
yeah.
it's a very different approach. And so we need to do more work in understanding how is it different, and to be able to learn from communities
Yeah.
on how you've been doing things for generations before
That's
this
right.
country existed, to work out what you're doing that's working, because
Yeah.
it is working.
Yeah.
And it's happening more informally, it's happening more organically,
Yeah.
and there's so much we can learn from that. So it's actually about us saying, well, we want to learn from communities and understand how you're doing things,
Yeah.
and how can that benefit the broader community.
So often volunteering is considered, well, I'm doing it as a volunteer work. I can do whatever I want to do, the perception is.
Yeah.
But volunteering comes with certain rights and certain responsibilities also.
That's
so
right.
can you just explain that also?
So we run a course actually with volunteers on rights and responsibilities.
Yeah.
And so it identifies what are your rights as a volunteer, and then what are your responsibilities as a
Yeah,
volunteer.
yeah.
I mean, some of those are about your rights as a volunteer are to be safe, to be respected, to be included, to be all of those things. They're your rights. You have rights, you know, as individuals, we all have rights that sit and do not get removed when we volunteer. And in terms of responsibilities, we say, well, your responsibilities as a volunteer, if you've agreed to do a certain role, that's really should be the role that you're doing. You've also got a responsibility to ensure you're keeping yourself safe and keeping other people safe. So it is there's two
Two-way.
sides of a
Yeah.
coin there.
Yeah.
And again, if you're in a volunteering role that's not right, it's best just to
Yeah.
not be in it anymore, because it's not serving you. It's also not serving the organisation.
Yeah.
So the rights and responsibilities course is actually really useful in identifying for people. And quite often people will say, I didn't think about it. I just thought I was giving my time freely. And we said, well, you are. But in that, we need to make sure that there's the right conditions for this to be what we call safe, ethical and inclusive.
Yeah.
And they're the conditions that we need to have sitting under volunteering.
So you just mentioned about the role being course being run on rights and responsibilities by the volunteering ACT.
Yeah.
That alludes, like, you know, volunteering is just not like, you know, just go and do it on its own. We need organization like your organization, which is coordinating. So can you just explain the role of the volunteering ACT?
Yeah. So volunteering ACT is the peak body. So
Yeah.
the peak body for volunteers and for volunteer organisations. So we represent both. And so the peak body aspect of that is that we advocate to government to ensure that they're considering the needs of volunteers and organisations in the full breadth of policy that they bring out, so any legislative changes. And so we're actively involved in making sure that we sit around tables and say to people in government, ministers, government officials, have you thought about volunteering? Have you thought about how this is different? So that's the peak body part. The other two parts of our business, one of them is in inclusive services. So we run a community information arm that's all about connecting people to community. And that's all about making sure people are linked with services and events and programs that they need in their lives. And we run inclusive programs, and I gave a flavour to some of that before in the inclusive volunteering part. And then the third part of the work that we do is around capacity building. And so it's about working with organisations to break down their barriers, to help them do their jobs really well. And sometimes it's just about us helping them work out how much compliance or regulation they need and how much they don't. It's working with volunteers to have open conversations with them about what's the right volunteer role for you, how can we help you get there, and doing what I call matchmaking, that link between organisations and individuals. So there's a fairly broad remit there. It all comes together really neatly, but at the core of all that we do is about making sure people are better connected and can participate. So.
Yeah, it's a huge and significant contribution. I mean, volunteering needs to have some kind of a structure, and that's what the volunteering ACT is providing that. And one more important task you do is every year you announce awards also for volunteers.
We do. Yeah.
volunteering is often done without any expectation of any gains in return. So what's the purpose of these awards?
Yeah, so a really important part of the volunteer life cycle, as we like to call it, is recognition. So people aren't being paid a wage, they're choosing to turn up. The people of Canberra are just doing such an incredible job in keeping this city going. And so the awards are an opportunity for us as the peak. And we can't nominate our own volunteers, so they're the only ones that are not able to be recognised through those awards. But where we say to the public, to individuals and to organisations, tell us your stories. Tell us who are the people you're engaged with in your families, in your networks, in your organisations that are just going above and beyond. They're just, the work that they're doing inspires others. It connects others. It actually, you can see and feel the difference from the contributions. And then we have the impossible task of taking all of the nominations and picking winners. And the lovely part about it is that no one that turns up to the awards has an expectation.
Yeah.
And the loveliest part of my job is every year I MC the awards and I look out in the crowd, and the shock on people's faces when they're recognised is just, it brings you so much joy, because volunteers don't need to be recognised and they don't ask to be recognised. It's our role as the peak to highlight and to recognise for them, if you will, to say, no, we know you don't want recognition. We think you need to be recognised. And so the awards this year they're always just a wonderful evening. And of course, Manish won our Volunteer Leadership Award. And the Governor-General turned up to the awards because she said, it's really important that I'm there to recognise the work of volunteers. And that's very special. So we're very lucky that she was able to join us on the evening. But for us, I think exactly what you've said is correct. People are not expecting recognition, they're not expecting payment, they're not expecting any of those things. So it's really nice when we can stand up on a stage in public and say, we see what you've done and we're really grateful for it, and keep it up.
Yeah, every volunteer is a winner.
Yeah, absolutely.
And these awards are just a formal recognition of...
and it's a tiny portion of Canberra's volunteers.
That's right.
And so you're right, every volunteer needs recognition. And that's what we say to organisations. Make sure you're thanking your volunteers. Because when you ask volunteers what do they expect out of their volunteering, what do they want? They don't want necessarily a flashy dinner. They don't want... What they want is for someone to say, thank you, you made a difference today. That's the answer we get most commonly. And so it's also asking volunteers, what do you want?
That's right. That's what we have been giving to Manish, that thank you. But this year he has got this Volunteer Leadership Award. That has been great. So it has been fantastic talking to you, Jean, about volunteering. Thank you very much for your time. I know you have a very busy schedule, but you still found some time for us.
No, my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.